So before we start, any questions? Everybody remembers what we're doing on Monday next week? Yeah? Okay, it hasn't escaped your attention that you'll have to do another one of those test things? Questions about the test? No? I believe the exam schedule is posted, is that right? Yeah? Okay. Does anybody remember when the exam for this class is? 14th. The 14th of December. Okay. That's not too bad. That's not too, it's not the day before New Year's or whatever, where it often is. Okay. So the exam will be, in some sense, cumulative, because all of the skills that you learn in each section of this course are necessary to do the next section. So keep up is my recommendation. Okay, if there's not any questions, we'll get into it. Today, we're just going to do practicing symbolization. Last time we did just practicing derivations. This time we're just going to practice a bunch of symbolizations. I have no new ideas to present to you today. I have a couple of things that I want to reiterate and maybe clarify a little bit, but then we'll just get into examples. So when you're symbolizing this stuff, when you're symbolizing in predicate logic, not every single sentence that I'll ask you to symbolize will be a generalization, but lots of them will. And the trick is to distinguish existential from universal generalizations. And that is sometimes genuinely tricky. So I want to address something that was talked about on the Quarkus, symbolization 3.015. A chocolate should be enjoyed. Okay, so is that about one specific chocolate? So there's two ways you could symbolize this. There exists one specific chocolate, or at least one specific chocolate, that should be enjoyed. That would be something like there exists an X such that X is a chocolate and X should be enjoyed. Or you might symbolize this as, if anything's a chocolate, then it should be enjoyed. I don't see anything in that sentence that disambiguates those two things. So is that sentence, I mean, if you got strong opinions about this, let me know. I don't see any reason, any principled reason to say that that sentence is either about the class, the category of chocolates, or about one specific chocolate. Does that make sense why this is an ambiguous, it seems to me, an ambiguous sentence. Logic 2010 doesn't accept both answers, but we're smarter than computers still so far, and we can say, I think Logic 2010 is wrong about this. I think, in my opinion, either way of symbolizing that, either as an existential, as about there is a specific chocolate, or as a universal, as about the class of chocolates, would be a reasonable way of reading that. In our actual lives, it would be context that decided that, right? It would be something about the situation that you're in, who you're talking to, what you know about them, your knowledge state, their knowledge state, all that subtle, complex human stuff would sort it out for you, whether this person is saying there is at least one chocolate that should be enjoyed or the set of all chocolates should be enjoyed. I'm going to try not to do this to you on the second test. I'm going to try not to give you ambiguous sentences. If by accident I do give you an ambiguous sentence, both answers will be considered correct. Yeah? So if there's two reasonable readings of a sentence that we give you, we're going to try not to do that. But if there's two reasonable readings of the sentence, then both will be correct answers. Okay? But the goal, I bring this up basically to get the goal of this. The first step of symbolizing any generalization is to figure out whether it's a universal or an existential. Yeah? And if it's a universal, that means it's about a category or a class. If it's an existential, you're saying there's more than zero of this kind of thing. Yeah? Okay. So to start off with an uncomfortable ambiguity, just to get us rolling. You know, I know that's always fun for you. Okay. And just to remind you about symbolizing universal claims, there are two ways of narrowing down the topic of a generalization. You can either add conjuncts to the antecedent, or you can add conditionals. So we did this before. I'm just reminding you. There's one thing I want to clarify about this, however. So if you're doing the conditional, do you remember this? Remember this thing about, I want to talk about the spotted giraffes. So I could either say, if something's a giraffe, then if it's spotted, then blah, blah, blah. Or I could say, if something is both spotted and a giraffe, then blah, blah, blah. So those are the two ways of narrowing down the topic of a generalization, a universal generalization. If you're doing the second one, if you're adding a series of conditionals, it's a perfectly reasonable way of doing it, the brackets have got to go on the right. And let me show you why. I think I was not clear enough about this in class when we presented it the first time. Let's compare these two ways of symbolizing this sentence. So we got the sentence, for all x, if fx and gx, then hx. And notice what happens when you move the brackets. So the first sentence says, if it's the case that if something is a fox, then it's well fed, then that thing is happy. Kind of probably what I meant to symbolize was all foxes that are well fed are happy. So number 2 says, if something is a fox, then if it's well fed, then it's happy. So you're the second one narrows down the scope of the discussion. The first one is just really weird. It's a really weird sentence that it's not the kind of sentence you'd say in English. And I want to point out the following to you. So the first one says, if this conditional is true, then the object x is happy. Which means that if x is a rock, or this mouse, or any random object that's not a fox, the first conditional comes out as true, right? Because the antecedent is false. Anytime the antecedent of a conditional is false, the whole conditional is true. So if x is a rock, something that's not a fox, anything that's not a fox, then the antecedent comes out as true, meaning this sentence is saying that every rock, twig, bird, and bee is happy. Right? The planet Venus is happy. The concept of the number 4 is happy. That's what the first sentence says. Everything in the universe that's not a fox is happy. And also, all of the well-fed foxes are happy. Right? Because the antecedent is a conditional rather than the antecedent being fx. So that's the difference. When you put the brackets on the left, you make this really weird claim. You say, if this conditional is true, then this thing is true. Typically, that's not what you want to do. If what you're trying to do is narrow down the topic of conversation, like, look, I want to talk about the foxes, and of the foxes, I want to talk about those foxes that are well-fed. If that's what you're trying to do, and that's probably what you're going to be trying to do, then you want to put the brackets on the right-hand side. Okay? So it's not that the antecedent is a conditional. The antecedent here is an atomic. In number 2, see the antecedent of the thing is an atomic, and then the consequent is a conditional, rather than the antecedent being a conditional. Okay? Is it clear why the first thing is a really bizarre sentence when we try to say, if that's our symbolization scheme here, F is a fox, G is well-fed, and H is happy, number 1 is a really weird sentence that makes claims about all objects in the universe that are not foxes. That's probably not what you want to do. Probably you want to make a claim. So the point of adding these conditionals is to narrow down the scope of your claim, right? And number 1 doesn't do that. It keeps it wide open. If instead of number 1 you'd written fx and gx, then hx, that would have been fine. That would have been about all of the well-fed foxes. Yeah? So that's the other way of narrowing down the topic, doing it with conditional or conjunctions rather than conditionals. But if you're going to do it with conditionals, do it like number 2. Yeah? Okay? Questions about that? I hope it's clear now. Yeah, yeah.
For the test, how is it expected to drop the sentences to variables? Will the variable be given to us, or is that supposed to be intuitive?
So is the question here, so if I gave you f, g, h in the sentence, how would you know it's x?
My question is, are you going to give us FGH? As in F is a
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely. So yeah, what I'll give you is FGH. So you'll see basically what you'll get when we'll do examples very shortly, and you'll see what you'll be getting. Yeah. So I have to give you the symbolization scheme. If I didn't give you the symbolization scheme, here's the answer to every symbolization question. P. How do you symbolize the foxes that are well-fed are happy? P. If you get to make up your own symbolization scheme, that's always the answer. So that's why I have to give you the symbolization scheme. Yeah. Keep that in mind for a smart-ass reply to anybody who doesn't properly narrow down the question. OK. So are we good there? Good. And there's this other thing, and we'll see a few examples of this in action. The weirdness of and or in these. So back in good old sentential logic, and or were pretty clear. If you saw the word and, you'd write the and sign. Or if you saw the word or, you'd write the or sign. But it can be flipped in predicate logic. And you really have to think about what the claim that you're making says. So if I say gold and silver are valuable, the temptation is going to be to say if something is gold and if that thing is silver, then it's valuable. But there's nothing that's both gold and silver, right? Those are two different kinds of things. So what you want to say is if something is gold or it's silver. Yeah? OK, so we'll see a bunch of examples of that and how you just basically have to think through what you're claiming and what would make it true or false. Yeah? OK, so probably the best way to show you how that works is examples. We've seen it before. We shall see it again very shortly. OK, so unless there's any questions about that stuff, I'll move on to doing examples. We'll just do examples until we run out of time. Yeah?
So back to the conditional. If it was a conjunction, does it matter where the brackets go? It does, right? Some on the left?
Right. So if we wanted to say, so let's try it. Let's try it. So here's how I would do this conditional. We'd say, and, sorry, I don't know, fx and gx, then this thing.
Are those equivalent?
So if we'd said this, I think that would not be equivalent. That would not be equivalent. Because there, number one, so the first one there is saying if something has both the property f and the property g, then it has property h. Whereas the second one is saying everything in the universe has property f, and if it has property g, then it has property h. So you don't want to, the first one is not narrowing down the topic of conversation. It's applying that property f to everything in the domain of discourse. Yeah? So the placement of the brackets do matter. So when you're symbolizing something, you're trying to narrow down the topic. Make sure that you're not saying this property applies to everything in the universe, and if it's got this property, then it's got that property. It's about putting so within these brackets, this whole thing is a conjunction, right? It's not a conditional. And typically, if you're going to say something, if you're trying to say a class of things has a property, you want a conjunction, not a conditional. So the major connective of that thing inside the quantifier has to be a conditional. It's good. Good. It's a good question. OK? OK, good. To the examples. To the examples. Right. So remember this stuff? Let's do a couple of these real quick, because I very well might give you a couple of these things about number. Remember number? OK. Exactly 2 of James, Tara, and Sam went to class. So this is not a generalization, right? We're talking about 3 specific people applying properties to those 3 specific people, right? So you do not need an existential or universal generalization here. It's one of those weird ones where we're just making a claim about specific objects. OK. I see people working away at this. Good. So this is one of those annoying ones. If I recall correctly, this is one of those annoying ones where you basically just have to say what all the cases are. You basically just have to enumerate all of the cases that would make this sentence true. So exactly 2 means that 2 of them did and 1 of them didn't. You don't know which 2 did and which 1 didn't, so you just have to say, it's just a series of disjunctions, right? So we'd say something like, so something or something or something. Yeah? And then we just go through the cases. And this will always be a reasonable way of doing these ones, just go through all the cases. The next one we'll do is a bit easier, but so we say CJ, James went to class, and TJ, Tara went to class, and it's not the case that, sorry, not TJ, CT, and it's not the case that Sam went to class. And then just do that for each of the possible ways of placing the negation. CJ and not CT and CS, or not CJ and CT and CS. Yeah? Exactly two. Yeah?
So does the order of the negation matter here? Like you have them all, like, say, at the end? Like you see how you have in the first one, CJ and not, and CT and not CS?
Yeah.
Could I say CJ and CS and not CT in the next, in the second bracket then?
That would be fine. So there are a bunch of variations on this that would all be logically equivalent. So you could say, for example, like if you said instead CJ and not CS and CT, that would have been equivalent to this. You can flip the order of these around. These don't have to be in this order. They don't have to be in the same order within each of these. All that has to be the case is that you've got three possible scenarios described with disjunctions between them, and in each one of them you've got the negation on a different one. Yeah? Yeah.
Why do you not need to specify that it's not the case that all three of them went to class?
Aha. So why don't we have to say not all three of them went to class? Because that sentence, so you perfectly well can say, well, no, wait, exactly two. So exactly two is, so you want to say it's not the case that CJ and CT and CS? Is that what you want?
Except for I was thinking the whole first thing that you wrote would be in brackets and then it would be an and.
Well, it's,
Oh, wait, I see.
there's nothing wrong with that exactly. It's just redundant. So you could say, and it's not the case that all three of them went to class, but that the possibility of all three going to class is already ruled out by what we've said here. Yeah. Okay? Yeah.
I have a question. I'm not sure if I'm thinking this right, but if there's two of the brackets that came out as true, the whole sentence also came out as true, right?
That's right.
So what if the first one came out as true and the second one also came out as true? So we have both CJ and CT
So it's,
and CS on the second bracket.
so the question is, what if two of these came out as true, but two of them can't come out as true? Because if not CS is true, then CS can't be true. And because these are conjunctions, all three of these have to be true. Yeah? So there's no possibility of any more than one of these coming out as true because they exclude each other. And there's no possibility of all three of them showing up to class because that's ruled out by any one of these. This is possibly the most annoying number case. The exactly two is possibly the most annoying number case. Here's a much less annoying one. This is one that we can do much less simply. At most two of these people went to class. At most two. So what does that rule out? There's really just one case that we need to rule out, because at most two is compatible with none of them going to class, or just one of them, or two of them. So what do we have? The only thing we have to rule out is all of them going to class. So how do we write? So let's just say, suppose we wanted to say they all go to class. That's just a conjunction, right? Say CJ and CT and CS. Right? That's how you say, if I said all three of these people went to class, that's how you symbolize it. and then you just stick a negation out front. Yeah? So it's not the case that all three of them went to class. Is that good? Okay. We did do this before, so hopefully this is just review, just a reminder that this stuff exists and is possibly going to be on the test. Okay? Okay, we're okay with this? You want to move on to some other stuff? A murmuring rolls across the class. Okay, let's move on. All right. So now we're into some generalizations. So you're seeing the word all. There's a good chance there's going to be some universal generalizations involved here. But is that the major connective? Is that the main thing that's being said here? Or so the strategy is still, same as back in your old sentential logic symbolization, the strategy is still first figure out the main connective. Don't worry about the parts. If you try to gestalt it, you'll get overwhelmed. Don't worry about the parts of the sentence until you've first worked out what the major connective is. So what's the major connective here? The hints are things like the comma. Commas are good. It's a good hint. It's not always the case that a comma indicates the major connective, but it's a good hint. Yeah? So the major connective is the or. So either this thing or this thing. Yeah? Okay, so rough it out. Blank something or blank something. Okay? And now that you've got the major connective, you can start looking at the parts. So really, you don't even begin to think about the parts until you figured out the overall structure. And then you just take the parts one at a time so you don't get overwhelmed. So either this thing or this thing. Okay, so all spotted giraffes are clever. We can do this. We know this. It's universal, right? Universal generalization. For all x, something, something. Great. Now, universal generalization, the standard approach is going to be, because what we're saying is this whole class of things has this property, and then it's just a matter of figuring out which is the class of things and which is the property. And that tells you what goes in the antecedent and what goes in the consequent. So, all spotted giraffes are clever. What's the topic of that sentence? Spotted giraffes. Good. So, we can do this one of two ways. We can just say if something is a giraffe and it is spotted. So if gx and dx, then it's clever. Yeah? So we've narrowed down, in the antecedent, we've narrowed down the topic of conversation, and in the consequent, we've said something about that topic. Just as good, equally as good, we could have said, if something is a giraffe, then if it is spotted, then it is clever. That would have been just as good of a way of doing this, right? And what's the bad way? What's the way that I told you not to do just moments ago? Put the brackets on the left, right? So if I said this, it would have been a disaster. Gx, then dx. Sorry, so that should be a c. Then cx. Okay? And that sentence says that everything in the universe, except for things that are giraffes that are not spotted, is clever. Your dog is clever, probably. Your cat is clever, less likely. The stars are clever, the moon is clever. Everything in the universe is clever, except for giraffes that are not spotted, about which this sentence makes no claims. And that is not a valid way of symbolizing the sentence, all spotted giraffes are clever, right? So that is right out. Okay. Yeah?
How do you get that conclusion from that sentence?
Well, because the antecedent is satisfied by anything. So what makes that antecedent true is anything that is both a giraffe and spotted, or anything that's not a giraffe. So the antecedent is true of anything. So the antecedent comes out as true by anything that makes the antecedent of the antecedent false, meaning everything that's not a giraffe or everything that's a giraffe and spotted. Yeah. So don't do that. Keep the brackets. Either do this and thing or keep the brackets on the right. Now, the other half. All clever giraffes are spotted. Same sentence, but we've got a different way of breaking down what's the topic and what's the thing being said about the topic, right? So different things have to go in the antecedent and the consequent here. So what's the topic of all clever giraffes? Clever giraffes. So we'll do exactly the same for all x. If something is a giraffe and it's clever, then it is spotted. Dx. Yeah? Feel good about that? Accept it for the purpose of getting through your day? Those are just as good as each other. Okay. Okay. Questions? All right, let's do another. All right. Come now. There we go. Okay. It is a necessary condition for every person to get what they want for there to be no one who ruins the fun. This is an axiom of economics, I think. Okay. Okay, so necessary condition. I can never, ever remember what a necessary condition says. Here's what I have to do every single time I have to figure this out. I think about fire. Think about fire. So if I say oxygen is a necessary condition for fire, that's correct, right? So if that means that if there's no oxygen, you get no fire. We all agree on that. Yeah? Okay? So does that mean the fall? So there's two things that you could say there. O then F, or F then O. And which of those makes sense? Which of those is the reasonable way of translating oxygen as necessary for fire? So if you've got oxygen, you've got fire. Well, there's oxygen in this room right now, and currently we are not all dying of fire. Right? We all agree that we're not dying of fire. Okay, good. You can have oxygen without having fire, so that can't be the case. It must be the other way. If you've got fire, that means you must have oxygen. Right? So necessary condition, O2 is necessary for fire, gets translated as this thing. Every time I have to go through this with myself, but nonetheless. Okay, now to this sentence. So what we've got here is, so if P is a necessary condition for Q, that means what we need is Q then P. Okay. Now, this sentence is a bit annoying, right? Because it's not saying, so what is it saying? What's being held up as the necessary condition here? What's the necessary condition for the other thing? Well, are they saying it's necessary? Are they saying unless every person gets what they want, sorry, if every person gets what they want, then no one ruins the fun? Or are they saying if no one ruins the fun, then everybody gets what they want? I think they're saying this following. So it's a necessary condition for this thing, for every person to get what they want, for there to be no one who ruins the fun. So I think they're saying this is this is necessary for this. So no one ruins the fun is necessary for every person getting what they want. Right? We could have written the same, the sentence could have been written the following way, which would have been slightly less confusing for our purposes. the necessary condition for everyone to get what they want is that no one ruins the fun. Or no one ruining the fun is a necessary condition for everybody getting what they want. Did that one make clearer? No one ruining the fun is no one ruining the fun is a necessary condition for everybody to get what they want. Yeah? So the thing that's, so P is a necessary condition for Q. This is our P, and this is our Q. Yeah? Okay. So we know that this thing is a conjunction. We're saying something is a necessary condition for something. And we decided that P necessary condition for Q, we're saying if person gets what they want, then it must have been the case that no one ruined the fun. Yeah? Yeah.
I'm still not sure how you know it's that way and not the other way.
So it is a necessary condition. So there's a thing that is the necessary condition and the thing that is a necessary condition for. So it's the for it's this for that is the hint. So yeah. Okay. For there to be no one who ruins the fun. Okay, then the hint is it is a necessary condition for. So keep in mind, it's a fire. Oxygen is a necessary condition for fire. Or yeah, oxygen is a necessary condition for fire, right?
Yeah, but like you only know it's in that order because you have like the semantic.
Right. Right.
If it was, like, if you switched fire and oxygen.
So try this sentence. It's a necessary condition for Q for there to be P. It's a necessary condition for Q for there to be P. Sorry. Yeah? No? Okay, okay. It is a confusing sentence. It is a confusing sentence. So what is the necessary condition and what is the thing that is a necessary condition for? It's a necessary condition for blank for it to be the case that blank. Yeah? Very worried looks. I'm getting very worried looks. Yeah?
Just to clarify, so you're saying that on the basis that like no one ruins the fun, then it's the case that everyone gets what they want, rather than if everyone gets what they want, then they're not inclined to like ruin the fun.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So what we're saying here is if it's not, all right, I'll tell you what, I'm not going to do a sentence that's this weird on the test. How about that? Because I've been unable to give you a satisfactory and concise answer to how you figure out which one is which, it will be of a less confusing form. So I'll say, if I'm going to use a necessary sufficient condition, it's going to be blank is a necessary condition for blank. Is that okay? Okay. So let's try this again with a less confusing sentence. No one ruining the fun is a necessary condition for every person to get what they want. Okay. I think that those two sentences are identical in meaning, but because I can't give you a clear rule on how to figure that out, I'll give you something of the following form. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. We still need to figure out how to symbolize this bloody thing. So let's do this. Okay. Okay. So now what do we got here? No one ruining the fun, this thing, is a necessary condition for this thing. We said if P is a necessary condition for Q, then we symbolize it as Q, therefore P. Right? So P is a necessary condition for Q. That means that it's going to be Q, therefore P. Yeah? Does that make sense so far?
So is necessary condition the same thing as only if?
Yeah. Yeah. Wait, is it?
Or like simple?
Is a necessary condition. No, because if this was only, so if we said P only if Q, then it would be if P then Q. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So let's dive in. So we've got the structure now, right? We've got the overall structure of the sentence. We know what the main connective is. We know what the parts are and where to put the parts. Now it's just a matter of symbolizing the parts. Yeah? Okay. So, no one ruining the fun. Let's do this one first. So, no one ruining the fun. Okay. Different people will, this will strike your ear differently depending on your kind of like natural inclinations as either a universal generalization or an existential generalization. My inclination is to read this as an existential generalization. So no one ruining the fun is there doesn't exist anybody, there's no object such that it's a person and that person ruins the fun. Does that make sense? We could have also said for all x, if they're a person, then they don't ruin the fun. Yeah? Okay, now the other half. Q. Every person gets what they want. I really strongly tend to read that as a universal, right? Probably, my natural inclination is very strong to use a universal. So for all x, if somebody is a person, then they get what they want, gx. Yeah? The topic is people. The thing that we're saying about people is that they get what they want. Yeah?
For the could you also do it that for all things x is not the case that if you're a person, then you ruin the fun, or is that not?
So for all things x, it's not the case that if you're a person, then you ruin the fun. I don't think that's exactly equivalent. I don't think that's exactly equivalent. Because that's the negation of a conditional, which is equivalent to nx and not fx. If I remember the negation of conditional rule. Do I remember the negation of conditional rule right? Okay, so this thing is the negation of this. So this is a conditional, this is a negation of a conditional, and that's equivalent to nx and not fx. So that's saying for all things x, they are people and they didn't ruin the fun. But it's not the case that all things are people. So that's why it's not equivalent. Yeah? Okay, so don't do those. Do these. Okay? Yeah?
How would this be different if it's a sufficient condition?
Oof. You just flip it around. So if we say P is sufficient for Q, then what we have is P then Q. Yeah. So if if there's fire, that's a sufficient condition for you to know that there's oxygen. So if there's fire, then there must be oxygen. Whereas it's not the case that if there's oxygen, there's fire. Yeah. But it is necessary that if there's fire, there's oxygen. Yeah?
But given specify negation, wouldn't not the case that there's the EX would be negation?
So, yeah, what you're saying does make sense. So what do we do? So the question is, if we quantify or negate this, what do we get? Well, what we get is for all x is not the case that nx and fx. But what we wrote before was for all x is not the case that nx and not fx. Yeah? So you're quite right that you can use the quantifier negation rule to think through equivalencies here, but just make sure that you get the equivalencies exactly right. So do we see how these two are equivalent? So this says, so no one's ruining the fun. This says, for all things, it's not the case that they are both a person and ruining the fun. Okay. If there's no more questions, let's do another. We're running out of time already. I had some big funky ones I was going to do. This is too similar. Let's see. Here we go. Unless there's a coffee shop open, Amy will be sad and no work will be done. Okay. So, as always, start with figuring out what the major connective is. What's the main connective of the sentence? And then figure out what the parts say. So, I'm going to guess it's the unless. Unless this thing, then this thing. Does that sound right to you? Unless this thing, then this thing, which means our major connective is an or. We got two big things. Okay. Now, pay attention to the parts. Unless there is a coffee shop open. So unless some coffee shop is open. Unless there exists at least one coffee shop that's open. Right? So an existential generalization. There exists an X such that X is a coffee shop and X is open. Good so far? So unless this thing, then, I should have given myself more space here, but then Amy will be sad and no work will be done. That's got some parts too, right? You're going to have to break this part down into its parts. Right? It's a conjunction. Amy will be sad and no work will be done. Okay, Amy being sad is saying it's not a generalization. It's saying something specific about this name A. That A has property E. So EA and no work will be done. Once again, several perfectly legitimate ways of symbolizing this. Like, hands up if that no work will be done. Hands up if that, just out of pure curiosity. Does that strike you as a universal? Put your hands up. And existential? Put your hands up. That's pretty much equal. Pretty much exactly equal. So let's do both. We'll do both. So no work will be done. You could write that as a negative existential. There does not exist anything such that it's work and it will be done. Yeah?
Did you choose a different variable for that?
No, in fact, no, I don't. Because of scope and binding. Okay, so remember this stuff about scope and binding. The question is, do I have to pick a fresh variable? Am I allowed to use x again here? Because the scope of this quantifier is just this sentence, by the time I get to this x, so this sentence was about coffee shops. A coffee shop has to fill this in. Whereas this sentence is about work. Is it okay to use the same variable? Yes, it is, because the scope of this is just this sentence, and the scope of this is just this sentence. Is it okay to use a different variable because I don't want to get confused? Yes, it's absolutely okay to use a different variable. So if you feel happier writing there does not exist a W such that HW and DW, that is exactly as good. Okay? Okay. And now we'll do the universal form. No work will be done. So for all, we'll do W again. For all things in the universe, if that thing is work, then it's not the case that it will be done. Very strong claim. Amy's sadness has caused all work in the entire universe to cease. Amy is a god. But nonetheless, that's what the sentence said. Okay. Yeah?
How do we know when to keep the quantifiers within the brackets or outside of them?
How do you mean? How do you mean? So,
You see how you have the example here. You have EX,
yeah,
bracket TX, and AX.
yeah,
But that's closed off into a bracket. Then
that's
you
right.
have the main connector there unless.
Yeah,
And then the rest of the sentence.
yeah,
Like, my question is about the first quantifier there.
yeah.
How can we tell if it's supposed to be enclosed in brackets, the quantifier?
Well, okay, so there's another way of symbolizing this whole sentence where we don't end the brackets there, actually. So we could have written it like this. There exists an x such that CX and AX, or EA, and it's not the case that EW, HW, and DW. So we could have made the scope of this quantifier this whole sentence. And that would have said it would have been logically equivalent. And in fact, some people prefer to get all of the quantifiers out front. They call it pre-next form. So some people think it's a more reasonable approach to symbolizing sentences to have, and you could have dragged this quantifier out front as well. So it would have said there exists an X and there exists a W such that blah, blah, blah. We'd have had to write it out slightly differently, but that's also a perfectly fine way of doing it. The reason why I did it the way you see here is basically just because I'm doing the sentence chunk by chunk. I want to just get the chunk done. I want to like only have to pay attention, only have to think about one little chunk at a time. So it's partly just me working with the limits of my working memory, why I did it one piece at a time. If they're logically equivalent, then each are as good as each other, though. So, yeah? Yeah.
If you have more than one variable, say if you have like x, w, or y,
Yeah.
could you move the y to the front as well?
Yes, you could.
So as many as you want.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. You can have a bunch of variables out front, all with their quantifiers, and then just have the sentence inside. Yeah. So that's what pre-next form looks like. I haven't been showing you that because I find this more cognitively manageable to do it just like one little piece at a time. That's why, anyway. Yeah.
When we have the quantifier and condition at the same time, who has priority?
Quantifier and a conditional?
Yeah.
Well, you can't have them at the same time. You've either got a quantifier and then a sentence, or you've got a quantifier and a conditional. Do you see? There. Yeah.
What if the second part also have maybe for all y, then we have quantifier and conditional at the same time?
You never have them at the same time. It's always one or the other takes precedence.
So when they appear in one sentence and no parentheses, which means the conditional is the...
I'm sorry, we're out of time. Do you mind if I answer this after class? Okay, thanks everybody.